Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kathy Goldstein. I am a neurologist at the University of Michigan Sleep Disorder Center, and welcome to the symposia today. My own interest in wearables stems from their sleep tracking capabilities, which we're beginning to learn so much more about and is so incredibly relevant because 100% of our sleep typically takes place in the home. And I've met a few of our panelists through research on wearable sleep tracking devices. I'm going to go through and have everybody introduce themselves before we get to questions. And also, please feel free to submit your own questions in the Q&A. So Jessica Zendler, we can start with you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. My name is Jessica Zendler. I was formerly at the University of Michigan. I directed the Michigan Performance Research Lab in the School of Kinesiology. So that's where we use a lot of wearables to assess athlete movement for performance and injury purposes. Since then, I now am a consultant and work in several roles around wearables, one of which being managing the NBA's Wearable Validation Program, which is a joint effort with the NBA Players Association.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Jess. Harpreet?
Hey, thanks again, by the way, Kathy and everyone else at Lisa at U of M for doing this and for inviting us. Also, like Jess, I'm a former U of M graduate myself. I was electrical engineer in 2006 and the CEO of a company called Aura. We make a wearable device called Aura Ring. And luckily have had a chance to work with a lot of the panelists today.
Awesome. Joe?
So I'm Joe Patterson. I have 25 years U.S. Army experience, ranging from in the uniform to out of the uniform, and wearables are of interest to the United States Army, from susceptibility to illness to performance optimization and tactical athlete management in general.
Great. Josh?
Hey everybody, appreciate the invite. I'm Josh Hagan. So I spent about a decade in the Department of Defense doing all things human performance for Air Force research labs, interested in physiology, wearables, human performance monitoring, augmentation. A few years ago, I left and went to academia at West Virginia University, where I direct a human performance lab, and still excited to do a lot of work in the DoD, work a lot with special operations, Army, Navy, all services, and athletes as well.
Great. All right, let's get to this exciting discussion. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Jess. So can you kind of give us an outline of the brief history of the progression of wearable technologies? Where were we 10 years ago compared to 5 years ago and now today?
I'm glad I got the easy question to start out with. But yeah, I mean, I think probably everyone here has a little bit different take, but really for me, looking at wearables, really chest rate straps, and GPS watches we've had around for a while now. And those are really, in my experience, used to analyze the training of athletes, and then started to move towards more player tracking with GPS. And then, but it stayed more focused on the athlete and sort of the elite athlete level, with people working on how best to train athletes there. And since then, kind of late 2000s for me is when they started to really pique my interest, which is when Fitbit came out. And that was kind of, to me, one of the first real consumer devices, basically accelerometer in the wrist, but it got people thinking about steps and movement. And at the same time, we saw those kind of measures, accelerometers and IMUs, inertial measurement units, start to move more into the sports space. And so we as a lab started playing a lot more with how to do that to track athletes, especially situations where GPS didn't make a lot of sense, and what we could get on the field. We did it in Michigan football games, Michigan basketball games, a lot of other sports where it didn't make sense to do optical motion capture and laboratory measures because it didn't really represent real athletes. Since then, in my experience, I've really seen it move more to doing heart rate from the wrist and doing other physiological measures at the wrist or the finger in the case of Aura, and then really trying to get some other novel measures like sweat and lactate and start to explore where those could. And I think most recently, and then sleep as well, of course, Kathy, a lot more sleep measurements that have come about with Fitbit and moving forward. And then most recently, I think we see a lot more of this uptick in trying to pull all these measures together to do things like readiness and recovery and pieces like that, these more nebulous terms, and sort of quantify those. So that's the last 10, 15 years in a couple minutes.
Great. So Harpreet, when you hear this timeline, can you tell us a little bit about where Aura fits in, the biometrics it tracks, and just kind of the history of Aura, how it evolved to where it is now within that framework?
Yeah, I think honestly just put it pretty well, right? Like we've seen sort of progression from like movement sensors and accelerometers, right? Moving then into different sort of point applications like, running and eventually like sleep or activity, I should say as a whole, sleep, and then, even larger picture things. So yeah, in terms of Aura, where we took the approach was, I think Fitbit was really smart, and same with even FuelBand, right? Like, people wear watches, people wear wrist-based devices, and put in an accelerometer in them. If you ship 500 million watches a year globally, and a lot of those under $100, you putting in a $3 accelerometer sensor or less now probably makes a lot of sense. There's some component you can get something else out of the watch and just tell them time. I think when you take a look at sort of optical heart rate sensors, one of the things, and again, I, got to work on this at Michigan, signal and noise ratios and stuff like that matter quite a bit. And so I think, what we found with the finger, and the reason, we made it a ring, is that that pulse signal from your hand is frankly about 2 orders of magnitude stronger than the wrist. And that's something, and it has way better signal and noise ratio than, what sort of the raw signal looks like, from a wrist-based device. So I think that was like probably the first insight, and as to like why we should even bother to try making something different, because we felt like that data quality could be better. And then I think the other main reason was sleep. A lot of consumers, I think, unfortunately, only 10% of the U.S. works out in a given day, and 15% in a given week. Yet 99.9% of us will try to sleep tonight, and unfortunately, like half of us on any given night are getting less than 6 hours, and that has a huge impact on your health. And I think we felt like, we could try to go toe to toe against Apple, Fitbit, Samsung, and all those guys on activity tracking, but we want to look at something that sort of no one was looking at that could have a really meaningful impact to people's health and recovery, and hence started on probably the premise of our company: focus on the finger, better signal, and focus on what we think could be hopefully a more meaningful application over time.
Awesome. That's great. And Josh, so can you tell us a little bit more about the testing and validation process for wearable devices? What does it look like? How do we determine if these wearables are accurate? And the question I always have is, how much validation is enough? When is something actually valid?
Yeah, all great questions. And I remember very specifically as Jess was going down memory lane of when I got into this, and when I think it was the first couple devices I looked at, Adidas was making a couple of the first things that I saw, like a shoe sensor. And I just had the idea of, we were trying to develop a lot of next generation stuff in the DoD, and it's still ongoing and very promising, but it was just like, why don't we just buy everything that's out there and see what it can do, right? So not hugely a scientific endeavor from creation, but there's a lot of things that we can get insight and help make our warfighters better, help make our athletes better. So starting to actually just play around with those and just seeing these things and just understanding, okay, what does it measure? What is it saying? And then very quickly it was like, okay, there's more and more devices coming out. So we need to understand everything we can about everything that's out there. So I'm agnostic, right? Whatever works, I'm going to use. I'm a scientist, I'm a sports scientist, and I'm a realist. So I kind of toe all of these lanes, right? So while I would love the cleanest signal ever, I would like a 12 lead EKG. I'm never going to get that raw accelerometer. I'm never going to do anything with that because it's very complicated, right? So that question of how accurate is it is my first question, because I want to use the most accurate thing, but it also has to logistically make sense, right? It has to be very usable, user-friendly, good form factor, user-friendly for the wearer, and user-friendly for the practitioner that's going to be implementing that data. But if I take it very simply and just say, okay, I just want to know how accurate this thing is, right? So that's when we just look at the device, and we try to be like a consumer reports. So I'm not going to try to hack into any device and like steal a Bluetooth signal or try to get raw signal, something that isn't something that a consumer could get. I want to take it as it lives. I want to take out the manual, how it tells me to wear it. I'm going to wear it that way. Whatever it says in the app, that's what I'm going to test, right? So if it says you've taken or you've burnt this many calories today, or you got this much deep sleep today, I'm going to take that. I'm going to try to see how accurate that is. So we kind of go device by device, and NBA's done a fantastic job on this. We don't touch anything in the or very little in the GPS accelerometer lane. They do a phenomenal job. That's a really hard thing to do. But anything from sleep devices, so we'll look two different ways. We might look in a clinical sleep lab to look at the measures there, which is the gold standard. But we also look at home, right? So can I take an EEG home and wear something so we get that natural sleep, and then just try to run a bunch of studies and just look head to head, and then we just publish it and say, this is the list, this is the accuracy. So I'm not trying to tell somebody what to buy. I've got a different hat to do that if somebody wants me to tell them that, but I just report the results. So this is how accurate it is. Kind of make your decision based off of that. So I want them to be able to read that information and say like, okay, this is 10 different devices. This is how they stack up on an accuracy scale. And obviously we have to peer review publish that, because that needs to be vetted very rigorously by the community and make sure. And you asked, when is enough? I don't think it's ever enough, right? So it's, you're going to have a lot of group, because inherently it's not like, depending on what you're doing, if it's a heart rate sensor, that's not a really hard thing to do, right? So it's something a grad student can do. It's something that you can implement pretty easily. But every setup is different. Every scenario is different. Like a lot of the work that Jill talked about, it's very specific to a specific group of people. So while I need to know how accurate something is, I also need to know how accurate it is in the context of that person doing their thing, right? An NBA player, while they have a lot of similarities to a special operator, have very different demands. So I need to make sure that it A, works, but B, works for that situation. So I think the more that's out there, the better, right? So like most research, you don't want other people to beat you to the punch. This, I think, is different. I think we want, like, I get excited when I hear somebody else is doing the same study I did and they found the same things that I did, because that makes me feel better that I think I might know what I'm doing. And that's generally what's happened so far.
Great. Yeah, totally agree. This is where we need replication, and we need a variety of populations, because we suspect that these aren't generalizable across populations, particularly something like sleep, but also cardiac metrics, because these are so different, whether you're looking at elite athletes, healthy controls, patients. There's just, there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you for highlighting that. Joe, can you tell us what the US CCDC is, and the military's interest in wearables? How did it start, and what's the DoD's involvement?
So that's a long story. So I hope you guys can buckle up. But military is very hierarchical, right? So the Army had stood up a futures command that actually looked at modernization of the force and put it all underneath. And so this is all brand new with respect to hierarchical organization. A subcomponent to that is the Combat Capabilities Development Command. And one of our emphasis as a subcomponent is the Soldier Center. The Soldier Center owns everything a soldier wears, carries, or consumes, and how to actually make a soldier on the ground in combat better. And so we got involved in wearables from the academic lab side and lab-based studies, very similar to what you guys do at the University of Michigan. We partner with other sleep experts at Walter Reed or the National or Navy Health Research Center. But wearables to us help us link physiology to operational outcomes. So if I can understand the development of the human and or the impacts of poor behavioral choices, I can then understand reaction time slowed, decision making's impaired. So we can link development to application and provide interventions to actually optimize the human weapon system.
Wow, that's amazing. So kind of different readiness for combat and readiness for performance and competition. It's kind of brought together here on this panel. So that's fantastic. There's some questions in the chat here that I am going to bring up. So someone asks, what happens when these devices cause burns, irritation of the skin? What devices cause the least irritation? How do you weigh cost and accuracy, particularly for students?
Happy to take some of that. I guess as the only person here that's making devices, so it might be. Yeah, so I think on sort of I'll just have to pull up that question so I remember all of it, because there's a couple in there. Burns or irritations of the skin, it's definitely a real thing. Frankly, I think, but another reason why we sort of like the Ring, I think people have seen sort of either Fitbits or even Whoops or even Basis Watch, I think was a company, that got sold to Intel, and those used to light on fire quite a bit. I had two of them. I loved them. But I think, when you start sampling things at really high frequencies, sometimes that those kinds of things can happen. One thing that we found just with the Ring, again, because that pulse signal is stronger, you don't need that much current to actually sense it. And so, we have like a 15 milliamp battery in the Oura Ring on average, 1.5. I think the average smartwatch now is at like 200 plus, depending on the model and make and year, milliamps. So, I think in terms of a fire and things like that, just we found, again, smaller battery, stronger signal, that helps a lot. In terms of metals, really good question. Our first ring was actually, it was a ceramic zirconia. We had a Gen 1 ring that was really big and only lasted about, battery life lasted about a day. This ring, we went to titanium. Luckily, we were able to improve the battery life quite a bit. And we found that, skin irritation, titanium gets implanted in the body all the time. So it ends up being, one of the most friendly things we could use. In terms of some of the other questions, cost. So cost is a real thing. If I could make Oura rings cheaper, I would. Hopefully, as we grow and scale, we can. In one sense, I think, that is a trade-off. We sort of prioritize accuracy and convenience. I think Josh was talking about, people don't want to wear a 16 lead, EEG. I would argue that people don't even want to wear a patch. Like, I used to take my HRV, with Vital Connect patch, and sort of a pain in the butt sometimes to keep sticking on every few days and shower and whatnot and try to not get it wet and stuff like that. So I think, we sort of looked at what we thought was a sweet spot of accuracy and convenience and, use the Ring form factor. I think the downside is, cost. You can buy, components like off the shelf heart rate sensors, good PPG packages that'll have firmware and even app connectivity from someone like a Maxim or an AMS, for pretty cheap. For an Oura Ring, we had to do everything sort of custom, and doing that. And that unfortunately costs us a lot more. And as a startup, our volumes aren't, in the millions of units yet. But I think that's something that we hope to drive the cost down over time. But it's something that we felt like there is a market that's willing to pay for these devices that matter to researchers. Ultimately, sort of the more health applications that, this whole industry does, I think will motivate people to pay a little bit more for accuracy.
Right. Harpreet, stay on. I'm going to kind of go out of order here with these questions because these are incredibly good. And I actually wondered the same thing about this one. So when it comes to Oura, what are the limiting factors to not collecting real-time information during activity?
Really good question. So we didn't actually really get into that either. I should have brought it up. So, optical technology is really good when you're still. I'd argue it's really bad when you're moving. So if you look at raw PPG signal and while you're sort of, walking or running, I don't think most people would be able to sort of pull out the peaks and valleys in the heart rate. In fact, I'd almost guarantee it. And so I think, what ends up happening with what a lot of wearables do, and actually this leads into the research and why they don't give a lot of their raw data to researchers, right, is you got to take shortcuts and extrapolations. And the reason is because, if you, with all that movement, you sort of got to build another algorithm, create a labeled data set as to like a chest strap with movement. How do you filter out that noise against a raw PPG signal? And I think, every company does that a little bit differently. That's a little bit of secret sauce. And they probably also don't want consumers knowing about all that noise either. And so I think that's another reason why they don't share it. So I think for us, when it comes to movement and, collecting heart rate, I think, we've put out in Independent Medical Journal that like with 49 subjects of Oura Ring, you could look at the HRV and HR overnight and come up sort of 99, 98% R squareds against an EKG. Movement, running and walking, that repeatable noise ends up being pretty good. But I mean, if you're going to do 10 push-ups, 10 squats, 10, jumping jacks, and try pulling the data from any of these wearables, if you can get it, even in the raw PPG form, or even just, the corrected values they give you, versus chest strap is going to be remarkably different. So I'd love to see that at some point, Josh, or Jess, if you want to validate that, because, but again, most of those companies won't even give you that data. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we focused on sleep and frankly, HRV at night, because, this technology does have limitations, and, why not capture stuff we think is more repeatable and valid and share that with people? That being said, we try to do more during the day. We've enabled a meditation mode where you can take your HRV, if you're still. I do think you'll see us do more during activity over time. But I think when we do, we want to caveat it to our customers and researchers that, like, hey, here's where we're at on running. Here's where we're at in rowing. Here's where we're at in cycling. And here's what it's like when you try doing a CrossFit workout. Because I think people need to know the shortcomings on sort of how to rely on this data. But it's a hard thing to explain, right? Again, I luckily got to study this at U of M, and had awesome professors that taught me some of those advantages and shortcuts, and was able to apply some of that to a product.
Great. We're going to be back to you, Harpreet, because there's some more in a minute here. But Jess, I want to ask you this question from the audience. So how do you rigorously evaluate the accuracy and validity of nebulous outcomes like readiness, or maybe hustle score, training stress score, movement index, etc., that don't have an obvious gold standard to compare them to?
That's the $1 million question, I think, and something I think I've talked with all the panelists here about before. You and I have talked about this a lot. It's really tough, and we're actively trying to figure out the best way to do that. I think of it a few different ways. The first thing is sort of what are the inputs into that, and how accurate are those inputs? So, for example, if a readiness score is taking in activity and it's taking in heart rate and HRV, I want to know that those scores, the data signals it's taking in, that those are valid, because junk in is junk out. So make sure first that it's good things coming in, and I think that's the first step. The second part that is really challenging right now is we can certainly, if we're given an equation of how it's calculated, and some of these are still pretty straightforward, or just sort of weighting factors on top of a few different things, then we can kind of replicate those calculations and see how they work, and see if they're close. So we can say, okay, it's doing the calculation, but is it meaningful? I think is the tough thing. And what we don't have right now are standardized definitions. What is readiness is a really tough one. So one thing I'd love to see us move for, and I think that will take leadership in certain spaces, maybe this is something Joe wants to tackle for the military, is, what is that definition for what is readiness for the soldier in a specific, what does that mean, and how's that defined? And then if we can define those things, or at least create those, I would say, I think then validating against outcome measures is a good level of scientific rigor, because at the end of the day, why do I want readiness? Well, I want to know that I can perform a workout optimally, or that I'm recovered in a certain way. So we need to define what that is. And then I do think comparing to outcomes, because at the end of the day, these are just numbers, but if they can mean something consistently to some meaningful outcome for the athlete, or for the warfighter, or for the everyday person, then it's meaningful. But it's not an easy process. It's something that we're kind of actively trying to figure out right now, is how we do those studies.
Great, thanks, Jess. And speaking of the combat environment, so Joe, how do you use wearables in a tactical environment when the wearable commercial clouds can't meet the military security environments or requirements?
Sweet question. So de-identified data. Everybody's doesn't have an identity, and therefore, and we also don't use geoposition location information of our warfighters with respect to that. So we don't have a implementation strategy of like a program of record that then would just be buying, say, 1 million Oura rings to then issue them to the soldiers. We currently have pockets of research that are using wearables to then inform decisions on the hard question of readiness. Although we try to stay away from readiness because that's a commander's decision. And we look at, say, tools of whether it be polar aura or fatigue science, where it gives us indications of physiological recovery. And so that way readiness would have a combination with skills. And so do I have the right skills? Do I have the right physiology in order to be effective? And going back to the cloud question, we don't have the solution yet. We are actively trying to figure it out. We had previous conversations with Harpreet earlier this year, who was like, I got enough on my plate right now, which is fair, right? Like there's a lot of things going on in the world of COVID monitoring, susceptibility to illness, but
we'll get there.
But we did have a conversation about trying to figure out, and it's going to be a combination of government work and industry, right? So we have to develop the right public-private partnerships in order to develop the security required, so we don't have de-identified soldiers just running around in the battlefield.
Great, great. So I'm gonna send these next ones. These can be for Josh or Harpreet. How do you determine the accuracy of an accelerometer? What is the gold standard comparison to know that it's accurate? And also, are there accuracy issues with PPG and skin color?
Yeah, Josh, you want me to give it a whirl and you chime in?
Yeah, that's all you.
I'll start on the second one. So I think, PPG, yes, I think depends on where you're measuring. Again, another reason why we found benefits to measuring on the palm side of the hand. So, I have, a darker skin. Unfortunately, I have a lot of hair. People make fun of me all the time, including my girlfriend. But, luckily I don't have tattoos, but all those things, if it's an optical signal, right, and there's a lot of variance person to person, frankly, can make that harder. It can be overcome, and it has been, I think, by some of the wrist-based devices. If you compare an Apple Watch 1 versus, like, I think an Apple Watch 3, on a person of color or even tattoos, I think they've improved quite a bit. I haven't tried a 6, 7, or whatever they're at now. But I think what we found on the skin is, palm is pretty uniform, skin is really thin, much more, I would probably less tattoos to deal with on that side of the palm. That would hurt a lot of nerve endings there. So I think we found that, again, as another benefit to sort of, we've sort of said we're the only wearable that's not racist, but I don't say that publicly that often. I think that's something that we found a benefit for. An accelerometer, that's actually an interesting question. So the manufacturers of these, I think often will give you sort of like different, resolutions, and you can normally get those spec sheets. So we happen to use a Bosch. I think we've said this publicly. Bosch, BMI 160 accelerometer gyro combo, and so they'll normally list some standard thresholds. When you go into production, there's different types of testing you can do. So you can do panel level testing of all the chipsets before you insert them in the devices. And then what you can start to do is actually calibrate from a software basis after that. So we happen to do that. We actually have seen accelerometers fail, in our software test. And then, we go complain to the manufacturers about that. So I think that's probably like, 1% of the time or less that we see that component, failing. I do think they're pretty robust now. Accelerometers have been around for a while. I actually, my senior design project at Michigan was working on accelerometer, fabrication in a photolithography lab up on North Campus. So I think luckily that technology has been around for a while. Again, I think to the physiological measure, though, is where that gets harder. Sort of what Joe, Josh, and Jess were all talking about is, right, you got to eventually compare that against how many steps, what does that relate to for an average person? Like, what is like sort of, what does G4 stand for an accelerometer versus something I'm traditionally doing that's measured? And I think that's a bit harder, because every application is a little bit different and the unit of measuring that application will be different. So I think that's where, you got to get sort of, again, these labeled data sets, and compare them and do that research and validation to show that it can be equatable to this type of measure. Josh, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add on.
That was perfect. I got nothing.
I've never heard that from an Ohio State fan, so thank you.
So Josh, what do you think the current barriers are to allowing clinicians to use wearable sensors outside the laboratory setting to do more objective free living observation to help decision making?
I think it's education. And actually, Jess and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, because I think there's a lot of good data that you can get. I think it's really dependent on the physician and how open-minded they are, because I understand, I'm definitely not a real doctor, but I understand like the times when you need that real accurate data, that you're making a life and death decision, and you need pulse ox and you need EKG and you need very specific things. However, there's a lot of great information. I mean, just imagine being able to just understand your patients 24 hours a day with some different measures, and being able to reach out when you see something going on, which is kind of what we do on, not in patients, but in military operators and athletes. Like, we can kind of flag and see when we think we're seeing under recovery or poor sleep or whatever that might be. And so I think that's when you can get proactive about the data, because generally when you go in to see your doctor, you're probably not going in for a good reason, like something's going on. But if you can do prehab and get out in front of it. So I think it's all about educating the physicians and just saying, be open-minded to bring your own device. Like, I just want to understand how much you're moving. I mean, you always ask, like, how many minutes a week do you exercise? Like, you could have that objective data and say, like, holy cow, you averaged 1,200 steps a day for the last 2 weeks. What's going on? Is there something? That could be mental health, that could be something else. So the more that we can just kind of get physicians comfortable with that, and I think that helps the more peer-reviewed publications that are out there that can show, like, this isn't just completely wild and nonsense, right? There is some accuracy to this, and just understanding when to turn those off. Like, we do a lot of work in heat stress monitoring in the military and athletics as well, and we use that as a flag to go see when do you need to go check on somebody. And, like, as soon as you get eyes on, that's when medicine takes over. Like, forget the wearable, forget the device, do your thing. But if we can help you figure out who to go see or who to go call, so I think it's not a diagnostic, but it's definitely something where you can flag and do some outreach and help somebody that, you'll have some false positives, but I think that's okay if you catch the ones where you have issues.
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit as a sleep physician. There's a few different reasons why these aren't used clinically. So even though there isn't a comparable way, we obviously want to know what our patients' sleep patterns are over time. There's multiple sleep disorders that are defined by your sleep patterns over time. Obviously, one night does not tell us, much about many of the disorders. That being said, accuracy is an issue, even though it isn't a life or death metric. We are, the medical community is the medical community, and we just really have to use things that are rigorously determined as accurate. And a lot of the problems that we've had with wearable sleep trackers is that the way that they are validated in the lab doesn't translate to how they're used, right? So if you validate them against polysomnogram for one night, that accuracy might not translate to nightly use, and it might not translate, like we talked about before, across populations. So that's been a big difficulty. And then there's the other problem too, is medicine runs way behind technology, and that used to frustrate me a lot, but there's also good reasons for that. We deal with private secure information, so we have to have, our electronic medical records are extremely clunky, but the reason that they're clunky is because they're set up so that you can't get in them. So they don't interface well with anything. So these haven't been, and physicians are faced with such an influx of data on a daily basis anyway. It's been hard to integrate this other tool into practice. That being said, I think we've agreed from our national committees that, we want to take into account what our patients are saying these devices tell them and engage with them about it, so we can use it to actually help their sleep. And I'm going to piggyback off that with another question. I see the benefits of these wearable devices with military personnel and college and pro athletes. However, in the case of general popular use, I've heard of people becoming obsessed with calorie burn, heart rate variability, and sleep depth to a point that they won't exercise or sleep unless they can track their movement and use the data to determine how much food they're allowed to eat based on their caloric burn. Should these devices be used with caution based on some of these negative outcomes? Should there be a warning label for disordered eating with these devices?
Happy to start that one. But I think the answer is yes. Look, anytime you create a score or some metric, I think people will, unfortunately, some part of the population will track it excessively. Whether it's stock prices, the price of Bitcoin, your bank account, social media, how many likes do you get, right? Like, there's always going to be, unfortunately, I think some people that, really just go super deep and are going to be looking at that for every little thing. I think what we can do or try to do from like the manufacturer's perspective is frankly be more open to researchers, let people know some of the limitations and shortfalls of these kinds of devices. I think frankly also we try to package it and sort of give messages to the users on purpose, though some find it frustrating. I think more actually are benefiting from it, where we try to do light suggestions, not super active suggestions, like, hey, take it easy today. Well, okay. Some people are like, wait, should I work out? Should I not work out? Should I do, my deadlifts and, really heavy, exercises today, or should I, do some mobility? And I think we try to give a little bit more of an open interpretation and let you still be the guy you just have a little bit more data behind it. And I think, for us, we found that helpful. I think people have told us sometimes they still feel like we're scolding them in the app and things like that, but I think much less than the other wearables. So that's one approach that we've taken. I just think it is a thing. I think it's important to recognize it. I think that kind of behavior exists in many different platforms, though, even outside of wearables.
Great. So I want to, we say this word a lot these days, pivot to discussing the relevance of these in the current pandemic climate. So for anyone who wants to answer, what is the rationale for using wearables to detect COVID-19? Why did this get started?
Josh,
I'll take a quick stab at that because I lived it, as I think we all did, right? So I think, and we talked about this a lot, like anybody working wearables on March 15th became a COVID researcher by nature. And I think it was, it's been a positive in the way that, we have this data that is pervasively monitoring and getting some different metrics, and we have a pandemic. So how, is there a way to utilize that right off the bat? So literally the thing I did the very first few days is I have a lot of different groups that I work with, and we use a aggregation athlete management system to aggregate that data. And literally I just took, and a lot of them wear Oura rings and they had some other things as well. So we just took what I talked to our team doc and just said like, okay, what would you expect to see physiologically with a flu-like illness? So being completely upfront, like we can't predict COVID. We're not even going to try to say that we can. However, is there anything that we can alert you with and say like, hey, go talk to you, or can the team doc just talk to you or find out what's going on? And that's a depressed heart rate variability, an increased resting heart rate, a spike in temperature, any big changes in respiration rate. So like literally we just coded those alerts into our AMS and said like, okay, guys, here go. You've got some data, do with it as you want to, but here's a starting point. And then as Harpreet and Joe can mention as well, like, and Jess, like then we've taken that the next step, and there's tons and tons of really great scientific studies that are going on to try to see if like, can we actually do artificial intelligence, machine learning to predict COVID or predict flu or predict something else. And I think there's certainly been plenty of papers that have been out there on that. I think the jury is still out whether we can do it or not, but I think the promise is there, right? We've got a bunch of data, a bunch of people wearing different things. I think it can definitely be done. More time, time will tell on that.
And I would just add, kind of piggybacking on what Josh said, I think the tricky thing with COVID, and we were kind of all, it's funny, we kind of were all talking about this as it all started, trying to figure this out. And one, we still don't have a great understanding of COVID, though it's getting a lot better. But I think one of the challenges is that what we have found is that there can be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic presentations, so someone can be contagious before their symptoms. So waiting for symptoms can be too late, and then we're passing it. So I think one of the goals of wearables is, can it be something where we can do an early identification before someone's in the situation where then they're spreading it more, or in the case of say a workforce population where we have limited resources for testing, can we prioritize and allocate those resources? So I think the key thing is not thinking about the wearable as a diagnostic tool. That's still, to your points, Kathy, there's a reason why our diagnostic criteria are where they're at, and they develop more slowly, and there's tons of research there. But if we can at least use these as a signal to alert someone so that they can prioritize a test, since we don't have infinite COVID tests, or at least allow someone to quarantine so that they're not spreading it to other populations until we can get more information. So I think that's the interesting thing with wearables, and also that someone's wearing the wearables all the time. So even if someone's doing a temp check once a day, one, temperature isn't super specific for COVID. It can appear much later in the course, or in some cases, not at all. But these wearables are on all the time. So we have, even if the data is not as accurate, coming back to this accuracy and practicality, wearable data is not as accurate as a medical instrument, but we're getting it all the time. So it can be pretty powerful in that way. And what's cool about wearables, including Aura, for example, is that we're getting multiple streams of data. So we're not just relying on heart rate or just relying on temperature, but getting a bunch of pieces that one alone may not be that sensitive, or at least not specific enough for what we're doing, but pulling them all together with smart people then applying good algorithms to that, then I think we can start to get some interesting information. So to me, that's what's exciting about this prospect.
So can you guys talk a little bit about how Aura was used in the NBA bubble for early COVID detection?
Yeah, Jess, do you want, happy to chime in?
I'll let you go with that. I can talk about our process for sort of how kind of we brought it in, but
Yeah, I mean, and maybe also just to build off that first question a bit, I think, both Josh and Jess, and, I think, hit it right on. I would say, practically speaking, there was no wearables around the last pandemic. So just period, right? We've never had this kind of technology or these continuous data streams, and now we do, right? And then I think, Fitbit, was, I'll give credit where credit's due, right? They did a study on the seasonal flu, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. And so I think that, even though the correlations probably weren't as high or as great, I think as Josh sort of said, the jury's still out there, showed some sign of potential. And even if you sort of have, more sort of, false positives, at least you can confirm it with something else. Everything Jess was talking about, right? Like, we don't have enough, tests in this country, right? Like, who do you prioritize a test to? A lot of organizations can't afford to test every single person every single day. And so, the prioritization of a test and being a bit smarter about that can be extremely helpful in this kind of environment. So I think those are, two of the things that, I just want to echo on what everyone else said. In terms of the NBA in specific, obviously legally, I can't say a lot. They do have a lot of lawyers, even more than research scientists, I think. So even though Jess and I both wish it were the other way around. But I think, frankly, what we have said publicly and are allowed to say is that, us as a company, we've seen signs of data changing, before people feel symptoms. We have 3 studies going on, one at West Virginia University, and one at UCSF, and then also, another one actually with, Texas A&M and Phillips, being funded by, DITRA, so in DIU, Defense Innovation Unit. So I think, what we have seen, still the jury's still out there, we need more data to collect, is that you can see when people may be getting sick. And so what we did is, we created something called a health risk management dashboard, sort of aggregated all those different things, HR, HRV, temperature, respiratory rate, and, sort of tried assigning a probabilistic score as to how sick you may be getting. And then we've had different people use that in, different mediums to prioritize the test. And I think, the other, frankly, biggest thing that I'll say is, like, everyone right now, is sort of on edge still. Like, I had a scratchy throat the other day and I was like, oh no, do I have COVID? And 90, I forget the positive test rate today, but, like, for the most part, 100 people go get tested for COVID, only, 2% actually are having it, right? Which is a good thing, right? But I think just giving people another sort of peace of mind, stream of consciousness that, okay, I'm a little bit more normal today, my baseline looks normal, like whatever it may be, is just comforting to people. And so it doesn't matter which organization, whether you're in the military, whether, frankly, we have frontline healthcare workers that have found that data helpful and reassuring, right? Or if you're a sports, on the sports court too. So I think that, honestly, additional stream of data is also just equally as comforting to the individual, sort of regardless of the deployment.
And the cool thing about the Fitbit study that you mentioned is they used it in a different way. They modeled it to predict, like, statewide outbreaks of influenza-like illness, which I think that, because, even with mask wearing, we've faced a lot of people who felt that their freedom was being challenged. And, so contact tracing and things like that have been hard. But if you can make these kind of aggregate predictions and, be prepared, I think that's huge too. So you have like on a personal level too, for those who are interested, and then an aggregate level where there can be policies and decisions that are made.
Totally. I mean, I think that's the future, right? It's not just, hopefully we can even help people during COVID, right, across the board in all these situations, but the next pandemic, right? And so I think as researchers, that's what's so exciting is like, man, yeah, maybe eventually we can get, between all of us here, like a really good finely tuned algorithm. And for the next influenza-like illness, wouldn't that be so cool? Like, oh, wow, this is happening in Ann Arbor, it's breaking out. You'd shut down, you do the things or something, right, to contain it to that area more. And so I think that's the future for sure.
But I think to me, what's exciting, and this may just be because I live it, but like that prehab mentality, like since March, I have been in COVID training. Like I'm looking at all my data and I know that good sleep leads to good outcomes. I know that exercise is good. I know that keeping my HRV up is good. And so like having that data and that feedback to say like, maybe I'm not going to avoid it, but if I get it, I'm going to do everything I can to have it bounce off of me. So can you use it? Health and wellness, how can I maximize myself in the case? So in the next pandemic, how can I be as healthy as I can and use that data to help drive that?
Yeah, and vaccine response too.
And I think, Josh, you highlight a really important part of these wearables too, kind of getting back to, I think, the question before about getting too obsessed with data and being just almost frozen. I think that the power of wearables is to really learn yourself better. And so that's, I think, across the board, where if we can get individuals beyond, besides the algorithms and illness detection, but just to know themselves better, and through that develop a better awareness of how they feel and how they're doing and what's the best for their overall health, in the long run, that should just promote better well-being across the board and better prepare us to deal with any of these illnesses. So I think there's hopefully more of us can become empowered by it and not frozen or dictated by that data.
Jess, are you able to speak to your role as an academic in kind of building the program for the MBA using the Oura Ring for early detection of COVID?
Yeah. So
if you came at it?
Yeah. So and yeah, like Harpreet said, there are certain things that are still kind of confidential, but broadly speaking, and Kathy, you of course are involved in this as well, is that the biggest thing first, as soon as this hit, and I have to really give credit to the MBA and the MBA Players Association for being really forward thinking to say, hey, can we do anything with wearables? And so we have this, just kind of for background for folks, there is a validation program, a wearables validation program that happens at the University of Michigan, as well as our partners, Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. And that's really focused on wearables that a team can ask a player to wear for practice. And we have protocols, and Kathy leads that sleep validation team. So we work closely together on that. And so that's existed, and they reached out and said, hey, is there anything wearables wise we can do with COVID? And so immediately we're like, well, what are the symptoms? Exactly what Josh said, what are the things that we could even look at? And so we looked at a bunch of different devices. Luckily, I knew Joe already, so I was shooting him emails, like, what do you think? So really reaching out more to other experts and people doing things, saying, what are you looking at? Joe put me in touch with Josh. I eventually got to meet Harpreet, so it was more just, we started talking to find out what's going on and identifying different wearables. And one of the first things we looked at was just temperature alone, but quickly learned, one, that the wearable temp sensors really were meant more for an ICU situation, not for mobile athletes. So again, back to the practical context, it just wasn't practical. And as we learned more about the disease, it really wasn't a sensitive enough marker to be used. And so that's kind of what we really started doing then, was identifying wearables that first could even work in the context of the athlete. And that'd be a mobile, healthy athlete, someone who's training and active and potentially traveling. Two, that it made sense, that it made sense to this disease. And we started to kind of hear more about HRV, respiratory things, and temperature. And then the next step really was, as an academic, our job was then to dig into the data. And so we kind of put back our validation hats. And even though we couldn't do our full validation that we'd love to do because of COVID and human subject research being locked down, we could look at all the published papers, talk to the experts, and at least figure out what were the wearables that had the best quality data that we could really felt like we could trust and we could see into, and that made sense for the process. And so that's kind of our strategy for that.
Joe, can you talk about the ramifications for the early COVID detection for the military and how you guys would use this, or how you are looking into using it?
Sure. It's pretty simple. Loss of manpower is really bad given the global environment. So the less people we have to go do good things for God and country, the worse off the outcomes could be. So we, very similar to the NBA, we had a wearables process for performance optimization, brought the NBA in. Josh was actually a partner already on the research side. So we got to ask from the Pentagon, do these have a place inside the military? And so the answer was, why wouldn't they, right? If you're going to use a screening triage tool to expedite the changes in physiology and coupled with changes in your own questionnaire, your own belief of how you feel, then can we actually expedite the care, screen and isolate out the most vulnerable, the most contagious, and it doesn't matter if it's COVID, it could be strep throat. Strep throat could just rip right through the barracks, and now we have lost duty days. Lost duty days equate to lost dollars in training value, which then actually results in a monumental bill to the taxpayers. So it's more judicious for us to apply good enough technology that then allows, also coupled with your own personal well-being, to then actually maintain a state of awareness to the commanders to allow for him to dictate the word readiness.
Great. What challenges have you faced implementing wearables for COVID detection so far from the NBA and military experience?
The military setting's tough with respect to compliance, how often they're syncing. We could always love that whole secure cloud thing, or offline app analysis. So that's hard. The personal identifiable data that go into a commercial cloud, that's always bad. So these are all like real challenges for an implementation. On the research side, it's a little bit easier because we can have coded keys. We can have battalion medical officers actually be enabled to decode people, do the isolating triage, screening. But when it comes down to full implementation, we have challenges right now.
Happy to add on to that. I think, for sure, privacy and security, like, Joe's absolutely right. Like, if I could, I would, already have stood up a separate server for, DoD. And by the way, NBA wants that too. A lot of people would love to know sort of, hey, how much sleep did that player get, right? And then, frankly, even bet on that the next day, right? So I think their performance the next day. So I think, data security is definitely real. Keeping it aggregated, de-identified, I think is really, really helpful. We've even found that in certain cases, like creating that portal health risk management, like how do you even communicate that to people who are giving consent to is an issue, right? So I think, we spent a lot of time on that. There's still challenges there for sure. I think compliance is definitely an issue. Oftentimes, like we do pride ourselves at our company on our retention, our general consumer compliance, but those people are choosing to purchase this technology, right? They sort of know what it is, right? We've had other people, whether it's Las Vegas Sands, we've announced as a public, was actually our first customer on this COVID application, but DoD researchers, right? Some of those people that you're enrolling just don't even know why I should wear this, and it's not something they're used to looking at. So they sort of feel like a burden or a chore versus a benefit. And so I think that is a real issue, and something that I think the more we explain, educate how it can help, frankly, that's what we've seen is the biggest key to making people sure understand what the benefits could be and how they can use it. Helps compliance.
And I would add to that as well, helping whoever's using it understand who's seeing what data. None of us like to feel like we're in a big brother setting and someone's just watching us at all times. So really developing understanding and transparency and trust to know sort of what data is being used, how it's being viewed, and how it's not being used and how that individual and their own freedoms are being protected. And I think that's a continually evolving conversation of how best to do that.
So we have a question from our group. How do you foresee wearables being used for return to play protocols and data tracking related to athletes that are positive for COVID-19?
Take a quick stab at that, because we
Great, I
live
was
that as
saying,
well.
not me.
I lived that as well, like working football camp and actually, seeing players that had been positive and were coming back. And like, I mean, it was a player by player thing. Like we had live heart rate monitors on all of our athletes, especially the ones that were coming back. Like they'd probably been, maybe even a month after having it. And like, there was issues for sure. Like it wasn't just, they hadn't been training, but I mean, they were definitely having issues and had to get pulled off the field. So that live monitoring was critical, right? So, but they knew who to keep an eye on, right? So it's like, okay, let's be very careful about return to, because there's return to play in a non-COVID world where they got injured, and by looking at training load, and how to bring them back in a rational manner, and you use GPS, you use heart rate, and you use things like that to know that. But this is like, yeah, real health and safety, and I want that. I have to have that live data when they're on the field, because we're going to go get them, put a pulse ox on them, pull them off, put them in, a cold tub, and make sure that they're okay. So yeah, it's a big deal. And I think we still just don't know. I think we know that there can be all sorts of different issues, and everybody's different if they've had it. So you just got to use this data to keep an eye on them as much as we can.
Happy to talk about a problem, or potential problems with that. I think, what we've found is even, when you're deploying a new technology, right, it's like people sometimes can fear that too. So I remember, one of the first calls we had with a sports team about this, they were like, wait, so should I hold that player out? Like if it looks like they're screening high on your wrist dashboard, or their heart rate is high on their Oura ring, or this, and, my answer was, of course not. Like, you got to let a medical test determine that, right? Not, this can just help sort of, we call it informed testing. And so I think, as this technology is still new, there's still, going to be false positives, false negatives, right? But hopefully we can just be a little bit more educated about getting to the right, protocol a little bit faster and efficient. And so I think, yeah, there's definitely still challenges. It's still all very new. I think the NBA had an amazing track record, obviously in the bubble of not really anyone getting sick, which is awesome to see. But this season they may not have that, right? I think from what's being talked about. And so no one's a pro yet and going back to work during a pandemic, but hopefully we can all learn from each other and eventually get there.
So in the interest of time, if everyone could go around and kind of talk about briefly and broadly what they're most excited to see that's coming down the pipeline in advancing these technologies.
I think Joe will say a really secure server. I'm just kidding. Look, from our side, frankly, I think this application is, didn't exist, right? We wouldn't have been talking about this a year ago, and it's not just this, pandemic, but hopefully future ones. I think that's super exciting. I think a lot of these health applications is wearable technology keeps improving, awareness keeps improving, sharing the data and how we do that, and privacy keeps improving. Hopefully we can see everything from sleep apnea materialize over time to, heat, stress, and fatigue as well, right? So I think there's just so many new applications that honestly makes this, space still fun. And to me, that's what's so exciting, that the opportunities are almost endless.
It's just getting better and better, right? So I'm excited about developments in sensor technology. Like I'm a biohacker myself, so I've got a glucose monitor on. Like that gets me excited, like continuous molecular level monitoring. And it's going to be choose your own adventure, right? That's not for everybody to jab a needle in their arm willingly every single week, but I love it because it gives me the insights that I want. But I think the enabler to all of this is application of artificial intelligence and machine learning into that data, and that's some of the things that we're interested in. Of, can I help you run your own clinical trial with an N of 1 on yourself with the data that you have, and help you make the decision? So again, choose your own adventure. I want to improve my sleep. So in order to do so, I want to learn how to do breath work and meditation, learn how melatonin supplement, like whatever that is, this data can help enable you to figure out if that works for you. And that's very specific for you.
Josh, while you're unmuted, somebody wanted to know the specific metrics that you found problematic in COVID athletes who returned to play.
So return to play, that was a specific application to on the field training as they were recovered, like no longer positive. And that was more of very much so live heart rate. So very high heart rates, like they shouldn't have been that high for the activity that they've done. And then, pulse ox checks with oxygen that was a little bit low. So it was very specific to that. Like they weren't quite ready to be out on the field.
Right.
So on the military side, I guess we're pretty excited to understand echelon data, right? What does it mean to an individual? What does it mean to a group? What does it mean to the team? What does it mean to a higher level organization, right? So we have cascading effect, and data portrayal is probably the biggest thing that will then allow us to basically determine a military member's born on date. So regardless if it's a disease or a traumatic injury, we'll actually be able to reset them and or push them beyond their born on date to make them better. So I think that's where this technology is going to take us, to allow us to get to what does performance optimization mean? What does better mean? How much better, how much great can we get? Can we get to our genetic potential? So this is where the military is trying to go.
And I guess for me, I think there's two things that really excite me, and they're a bit different. The first, I think one of the silver linings of this horrible pandemic is that we're starting to be more comfortable with the idea of telehealth. And I'm excited. 10 years ago when I started playing with this space, we're like, oh, next year we're going to use wearables for health monitoring. Obviously that hasn't happened, but I think now we're starting to get some buy-in where there can be a role, and it's an evolving role, but I'm excited to see that telehealth model and that way that we can use wearables to start inform this decision-making better, medical decision-making. There is some opportunity there and some buy-in, and I'm excited to see where that can go. And then of course, given my role and where I spend a lot of my time, the nerdy side of me really likes that there's a lot of conversation around validation, and there's people here at the table that like to spend time with that. And as boring as it sounds, I think that's one of the most personally important things for moving this field forward, is making sure we have quality wearables and we have companies that are bought into that, and we have really informed researchers and workers in the space across the board. And so I'm excited by all the different efforts happening in that validation space to really have this conversation and really put the expectation that these wearables will be accurate and valid, and using that to really hopefully then create better trust in them and better data ultimately.
Great. Well, we're going to let that be our wrap up. Thank you guys so much to all of you. This was amazing. And thank you to the audience's amazing questions. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all of them. There were so many incredible ones. And I hope everybody stays safe and enjoys the rest of their week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.